Well, here we are under the 66 Toronado, and I'm taking out the radiator to get it re-cored at my favorite place, Ferndale Radiator in Ferndale, Michigan. Call Mel, tell him Adam sent you, by the way, if you need a radiator replaced. And why am I doing that? I noticed this part of the core, you see the dampness there? The radiator seems to be cooling fine, but that worries me a little bit. And I plan on keeping this car, so I'd rather just get it re-cored. And another trick that you can do to see if you need your radiator to be re-cored is fill it up to the, you'll notice all these radiators have a full cold. There's no coolant bottle here. You do not want to fill it all the way up. You want room for the coolant to expand when it's hot. But fill it up to the fill cold line. And then if after you drive it, particularly after driving it for long distances on the freeway and you stop and turn it off, take a look at the level in here. And if the level is well below this full cold line, I've had some radiators where after driving the car, the antifreeze will come down to here. It'll keep burping out until it comes down to here. That's even with, you always want to make sure you have a new radiator cap. So this has a new radiator cap on it. That means that your core has a clog somewhere. And basically it's not flowing as much as it should be, because the coolant isn't able to expand that much and it's burping it out the overflow. So to me, that's a great symbol that the radiator's got to be re-cored if this coolant level is nowhere near that full cold mark. If it's like one, let's call it an inch below, okay. But if it's way down here, you need to get a radiator re-core. And I highly recommend radiator re-cores versus new radiators, because you know it's going to fit. You gave the old one to the person, you're going to get it back. The new radiators that are aluminum, I think they're just junk. Find a good person who can re-core your old stuff, and it'll last. This one lasted since 1966 and it's still going. It could probably even last a couple more years, but it's just not worth it. Another tip is on these, the first thing I always do before I take the support brackets is just inspect and see how big of a job you're getting into. This one looks very easy because you can tell the radiator is only held in by this single shroud, and that's secured by these 4 bolts here, and that's it. So there's nothing else holding it in. I can tell I can get it out with the fan clearance here. And the next thing I do is I check to see, before draining the coolant, can I get these fittings out for the transmission coolers on the top and the bottom? Because sometimes what happens if these radiators have been in for a long time, these are hard to crack open, get them out of the radiator. GMs are easier, I find. They have just this fitting that goes in here. You don't have something to put another wrench on to keep it tight. Like the Fords, you gotta have another wrench where this goes in to make sure that you're not over torquing this and putting undue stress on where this goes into the radiator. But GMs are pretty easy. By the way, GMs have a lot bigger transmission cooler, which is what that is right there, than the Fords. GMs have a nice little finned transmission cooler in here. The Fords is just a cylinder through which coolant flows. So sorry, Ford people, and I'm a Ford person as well. There's a 68 Mercury and a 73 LTD in there. But the GM cooling systems are better, I would say. In any event, make sure that you can get these loose. Always use a flare wrench. Do not use an open-ended wrench. You need something that has more than just 2 sides where you're gonna try to exert force. And this is the best thing to do. And you wanna make sure that when you undo these, that you try to do it with quick blows. Don't push and push and push gradually more and more. You'll just risk rounding that off. And usually they'll crack loose. Sometimes you're gonna have a problem though where this won't spin freely and it'll start twisting the line. So watch out for that. What I tend to do in those circumstances is shoot some PB blaster behind here ahead of time if I notice that it's not spinning, and then just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, back and forth, time and time again. Maybe tap this with a hammer a few times lightly, and usually it gets off. I've only had one instance out of probably, redoing 20 radiators where this just would not spin. I even used an acetylene torch and heated it up, got it red hot, and it just still would not spin. And in that case, I had to cut the line and put in a splice, which wasn't fun. You really can rebend the whole line, but I admittedly didn't do that. And it's worked fine for 10 years, so it's just fine. But that's a big thing. Like, these are all things that before you get really deep into draining the coolant, which is always a mess. There's a little drain petcock over there that you can open. Sometimes those are seized and they drain slow. I just pull the lower radiator hose off. What I do is I keep the radiator cap on. I'll put this back on so that it's not going to start flowing out very quickly when I take the lower radiator hose off, because no air can get in, or not a lot of air can get in. And then once I've got the drain pan situated in the right place, then I'll take the radiator cap off and let it just all come out. So those are a few tips. You always want to make sure that you have a good cooling system in these cars, particularly ones with just an idiot light. And after a while, you'll get experienced at holding your hand on here. You can get an infrared thermometer and shoot it at the thermostat housing just to see what temperature the car is running at. So I have one of those, but I've been doing this for so many years now, I can just hold my hand on here and feel what temperature roughly it is, and also back here to see if the air that the fan is sucking through is also overly hot. This car, now that's got new thermostat in it, runs perfect. It runs, I put a 165-degree thermostat in there. It really doesn't top down unless you're sitting idle in traffic. And these non-air conditioning cars have a pretty wimpy fan here, where the pitch isn't all that great compared to the declutching fans, so that they didn't make a lot of noise at higher RPM. Ideally, you can put a declutching fan on here, and then at idle, when it's hot, you'll pull more air through this radiator. But I haven't had a problem with this one. It hasn't even come close to overheating ever. That said, best to just get it recorded if you see a lot of the seepage, or sometimes you look over here, you can notice the scale that's forming. So there's little leaks that exist in this radiator, and like I said, it's from 1966, so it's running on borrowed time at this point. Best to just get it record. You can see my new fuel pump. Oldsmobile fuel pumps are always in that location, just in case you're wondering. And sometimes on these cars, what I'd recommend, especially you can tell this one is a pretty low intake and the fuel line's running close to the block, just get some heat wrap from Summit Racing or someplace and wrap the fuel line. You'll get a lot less vapor lock on these cars than if you don't have that. The ethanol fuel has a lower boiling point than the fuel they used to use back in the day. So that tends to help the warm starting. Again, this car hasn't been that much of an issue, especially if you run a 165-degree thermostat. I find that helps with the hot starting. I usually run 165 or 180-degree thermostat in my cars. I don't put in these old cars 195-degree. I just find that the cars start better and run better with the cooler thermostat. I'm not out here for efficiency. You know, this car probably around town gets 8 miles per gallon, probably about 14 highway, but efficiency is clearly not my principal aim when driving this around. So there's a few tips for you. And I should replace this lower radiator hose. This is a non-stock, just flex hose here. So I'll probably order one of those and install this radiator, or maybe not. They work just fine. So it's getting harder and harder to get the right radiator hose for these cars. So this one is the correct molded hose, as you can see, and the thermostat housing is also, yeah, that's got to be a molded hose. It's not kinking there. So some of these parts are getting harder to find. Generally, I used to be a big fan of replacing everything and do the job right. Well, it's about impossible to do the job right these days. It's just really, really hard to get the right parts. And so now I've switched to, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and keep the OE parts for the longest period of time. Back when I was younger, I would have gotten one of these. I would have put a new fuel pump on, would have had a new alternator put on, saved the original one, and I would have even put on a new starter, just so that I thought it was totally reliable. And then I realized that the parts quality today is junk, and you're actually better off with a 50-plus-year-old alternator and starter than you are with a new, well, or rebuilt one, as they often are. So I just leave them. And usually these old starters and alternators also give you a warning before they totally crap out on you. Alternators maybe not. If the bearing is going bad, then yes, you'll hear it, but not if there's a diode or something internal. Starters usually start cranking slowly or making funny noises. Haven't had one, I don't think, that's totally just crapped out without me noticing something strange beforehand. And maybe I should have listened to it, but amazing. 50, 60-year-old OE parts are better than new stuff, but sadly that's how it is. So let's get this radiator out. I'm going to take it to my wonderful friend Mr. Mel at Ferndale Radiator. Cool. Well, and there you have it. It's out. So one thing I will say, there's these rubber isolators here. You want to just be careful that, as best as you can, don't let those rip. So be gentle when you take this radiator out. I kind of try to wiggle it back and forth a little bit, and then get my finger or screwdriver under here just to pry it away from the radiator. They're often stuck. And those can be hard to find. So, but there it is. Going off to the radiator repair shop, and I just hose this out with water here just to clean out all the dust and debris and everything. So, might as well do that while you've got this all together.